The clock strikes midnight, the champagne flows, and resolutions are made. But for some, New Year's Eve isn't a time of celebration, it's a night when the line between the ordinary and the unexplainable blurs. Tonight, I bring you 3 chilling stories of New Year's horrors that you won't soon forget. Sit back, but don't get too comfortable, because when the clock strikes 12, the real nightmare begins. I used to work late shifts as a rideshare driver. New Year's Eve was one of the busiest nights of the year, people trying to get to parties, bars, and eventually home in the early hours of the morning. The money was good, but the crowd could be unpredictable. That night, I started my shift at 10 p.m., determined to cash in on the holiday rush. It was close to midnight when I got a ping for a pickup. The address was on a deserted stretch of road outside the city, a bit unusual, but not unheard of. Maybe someone had broken down or lived in one of the few isolated houses out there. When I pulled up to the pin, there was no one in sight. Just the dark road, a few leafless trees, and the glow of my headlights. I waited a few minutes, checking my mirrors and scanning the area. Still no one. I was about to cancel the ride when the passenger door opened, and a woman got in. She was wearing a thin, red dress, far too light for the freezing weather, and her hair was damp, like she'd been out in the rain, though the sky had been clear all night. "Cold night," I said, trying to make small talk. She didn't respond. She just sat there, staring straight ahead with a blank expression. Her face was pale, and her hands rested stiffly in her lap. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She finally spoke, her voice soft and almost distant. "Home." I checked the app, but there was no destination entered. Can you put the address in? Or just tell me, and I'll type it." She didn't move or respond, just kept staring ahead. The uneasy feeling in my gut was growing, but it was late, and maybe she was just drunk or upset. I decided to drive back toward the city, figuring she'd eventually say something. The ride was dead silent. No music, no conversation, just the hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires. I glanced at her every so often in the mirror, and every time, she was in the exact same position, her face emotionless. About 10 minutes in, she finally spoke again. "You missed the turn." Her voice was sharper this time, and it made me jump. I hadn't seen any turn-off or side road. "Sorry, I didn't see it. Can you tell me where it is?" She didn't answer. Frustrated, I slowed the car and started looking for any kind of road or driveway. That's when I noticed something strange. The windows were fogging up, even though the heater was on. I glanced at her through the mirror again, and my stomach dropped. She was looking at me now, her head tilted slightly, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Pull over," she said. Her tone sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated. "Why?" "There's nothing out here. Pull over," she repeated louder this time. Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl, but I complied. I pulled to the side of the road, and as soon as the car stopped, she opened the door and got out. She didn't slam it or walk away. She just stood there, right outside the car, staring at me through the windshield. Her hair hung limp over her face, and her breath clouded the air in short, sharp bursts. I rolled the window down slightly, keeping my hand on the gear shift. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed back down the road. "You missed the turn," she said again, her voice echoing unnaturally in the still air. I'd had enough. My instincts screamed at me to leave, so I rolled up the window, put the car in drive, and sped off. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I drove, expecting to see her standing there, but she wasn't. She was gone. The rest of my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every shadow, every car in my mirrors felt like her. When I finally got home, I checked the app to see if the ride had registered. It hadn't. No record of the pickup, no payment, no nothing. I don't drive nights anymore. It was a typical New Year's Eve. I had invited a few close friends over for a low-key party. Nothing big, just drinks, music, and laughter as we rang in the new year. I wasn't in the mood for anything too wild, and besides, after a long year, I needed a peaceful celebration. Around 10 p.m., my friend Sarah, who lived nearby, texted me saying she would be arriving late, around midnight. I thought nothing of it. She often had last-minute work things to wrap up, so I assumed she was just running behind. As the evening wore on, the small group of us laughed, talked, and played games. The minutes ticked away until it was almost time for the countdown. As the clock approached midnight, I checked my phone again to make sure Sarah hadn't texted to say she was close. But there was nothing. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone else. I went to the door, expecting to see Sarah, but instead, there stood a man I didn't recognize. He was in his late 30s, with messy dark hair and a heavy coat, despite the warm night. He looked at me with an unreadable expression and said, "I'm here for the party. Sarah invited me." I blinked, unsure how to respond. "Sarah?" I asked. "She didn't mention inviting anyone else." The man seemed unfazed by my confusion. He simply nodded. "She told me to come by after work. I just got off late." It struck me as odd. Sarah had been texting me all day, and she had never mentioned inviting anyone else. But being polite, I didn't want to make things awkward. Maybe she had mentioned him in passing, and I forgot. "All right, come on in," I said, stepping aside to let him through. The man gave me a slight smile and walked past me into the living room. I closed the door behind him, still uneasy, but tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe he was just a friend of Sarah's, and I didn't know him. But the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I felt. His presence was too unsettling. When I returned to the living room, I noticed the man standing in the corner, not really talking to anyone. He was staring at the TV screen, his face blank and expressionless. The others were too caught up in their own conversations to notice anything strange. I tried to engage him in conversation, but he was distant, almost as if he wasn't really there. I glanced at my phone again to check if Sarah had texted me, but still nothing. I was starting to feel increasingly uncomfortable, unsure whether I should address the situation or just let it go. At midnight, we all gathered around the TV for the countdown. As we counted down, I glanced at the man. He was standing in the exact same spot, still silent, his eyes fixed on the screen. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something wasn't right. After the ball dropped, we all cheered and hugged, and the man stayed in the corner, as if he didn't understand the celebration. He didn't even acknowledge the cheers. It felt as though he didn't belong. Around 12:30 a.m., Sarah finally texted me, saying she had just wrapped up and was on her way. Confused, I looked up at the man. He was still in the corner, as if time had stopped for him. When Sarah arrived a few minutes later, I greeted her at the door, still uneasy. "Hey, I'm glad you could make it," I said. "There's someone here who says you invited him." Sarah looked at me, her face confused. "Who?" I pointed to the man standing in the corner. He was still staring at the TV, completely oblivious to us. Sarah's face drained of color. "I didn't invite anyone. Are you sure?" I nodded, but before I could say anything else, I heard the man speak. "I'll be leaving now," he said, his voice cold and flat. And just like that, he turned and walked out the door without another word. I rushed to lock the door behind him. I was shaken. Who was he? And why had he acted so strange? Sarah and I talked for a while, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I kept checking my phone, waiting for any text from her about him. But all she said was, "I've never seen that guy before in my life." The next morning, I called the bar where Sarah worked, hoping she might have mixed up some details. The bartender who answered the phone said he didn't know anyone by that name, and when I asked if they had any new employees recently, he responded, "We haven't hired anyone in the last few months." To this day, I don't know who that man was or how he got into my home. I haven't spoken to Sarah about it again, and she hasn't mentioned anything about him either. But whenever New Year's Eve rolls around, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one at that party, and the thought of the forgotten guest still haunts me. It was supposed to be a fresh start. That's how they'd convinced me. A New Year's Eve party. A chance to get away from the pressures of life, to unwind and start over, they said. But from the moment I stepped into that house, something felt wrong. And as the night unfolded, I realized I'd walked into something I couldn't escape. I was invited by an old friend, Claire, someone I hadn't seen in years. She'd always been a bit odd, but that was part of her charm. When she sent the invitation, I figured it would be a nice opportunity to reconnect, to forget the weight of the past year for just one night. After all, who doesn't love a good party on New Year's Eve? I arrived just after dark, the house tucked away in a remote corner of town. It wasn't like the usual New Year's parties I'd attended, bright lights, laughter, music. Instead, there was an eerie quiet that seemed to hang in the air. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Claire greeted me at the door with a smile that seemed a little too wide. Her eyes, though, they were unsettling. There was something distant in them, something I couldn't place. But she was my friend, and I didn't want to be rude, so I pushed those thoughts aside. Inside, the house was dark, almost candlelit in a way that didn't feel cozy. The walls seemed to close in, and the floorboards creaked with every step. The other guests were scattered around, some sitting silently by the fire, others whispering to one another. They looked strange. Like they didn't quite belong to the world outside, like they were stuck in some time long past. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just the dim lighting or my overactive imagination. But as the night wore on, I felt more and more uncomfortable. At midnight, Claire gathered everyone together. The clock ticked closer to the new year, and she stood at the front of the room, holding up a glass of champagne. "Happy New Year," she said, but there was something cold in her tone, something that sent a shiver down my spine. I clinked my glass, half-heartedly, and took a sip. But the moment I did, I felt a wave of dizziness hit me, a sudden nausea that made me stagger back. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog, but it only deepened. Before I could react, the room went silent. It was as though every person there had stopped breathing at once. And that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The candles were flickering, casting long, twisted shadows against the walls. But there was something else, someone else. In the corner of the room stood a figure, cloaked in darkness, barely visible. It was as if they were part of the shadows themselves. I blinked, and the figure was closer. Another blink, and it was right behind Claire, standing with a stillness that felt unnatural. I tried to call out, but no sound came. My mouth was dry, my limbs numb. Claire turned, her smile fading. The figure behind her stepped into the light. It was a man, or something that looked like a man. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, black as coal, locked onto mine. I could feel his gaze burrowing into me, pulling me in like a magnet. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, but my voice sounded foreign to me, distant. Claire's expression twisted, no longer friendly, no longer human. She smiled, but this time, there was malice in her eyes. "You should have left when you had the chance." Suddenly, all the guests in the room turned toward me. Their eyes were the same as the man's, black, soulless. They stepped forward in unison, their movements jerky and unnatural. A low, guttural chant began, a language I didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. It wasn't a celebration. It wasn't a party. It was a ritual. Before I could turn to flee, The front doors slammed shut, locking with a deafening click. My heart raced as I realized there was no way out. They were closing in, the circle tightening around me. Then, with a sudden, violent force, everything went dark. I woke up outside, lying on the cold ground, the sounds of distant fireworks echoing through the night. I had no memory of how I'd gotten there, no memory of escaping. The house was gone, vanished. Only the trees remained, whispering in the wind like they knew a secret I wasn't meant to hear. But what chilled me to my core was the feeling that followed me for weeks after. I began hearing the whispers in the dark, catching glimpses of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of my vision. Every New Year's Eve since, I feel that cold presence lurking nearby, waiting. Now, I never answer invitations for New Year's parties, never let myself get too close to the edge of the unknown. And every year, when the clock strikes midnight, I hold my breath, wondering if this will be the one where they finally come for me. Thank you so much for watching. The story may be over, but trust me, the darkness never really leaves. If you want more spine-chilling stories to keep you up at night, hit that subscribe button. And join the Nightfall Hour family. We're just getting started, and you won't want to miss what's next. Until then, stay safe, and remember, the shadows are always closer than you think. See you in the next one.